What if I told you there's an ancient religion of African kings who worshipped gods who rivaled Yahweh himself? What if this story was deliberately erased from history books because it revealed such immense spiritual power that it threatened the religious narratives we know today? Have you ever stopped to think why you've never been told about the Black Kings who challenged the God of Israel in epic spiritual battles? Why was this information hidden for centuries? The truth is, there's a closely guarded secret about an African religion so powerful that its rituals made the Hebrew prophets tremble with fear. We're talking about an ancestral faith that existed long before Christianity and Islam arrived in Africa, a religion that had its own gods, its own prophets, and its own miracles. This religion wasn't just a passive belief. It was a complete system of spiritual, political, and military power that shaped entire empires. The kings who practiced this faith weren't submissive. They were spiritual warriors who believed their gods were superior to any foreign deity. And here's the most shocking part. There are historical records and ancient texts that prove direct confrontations between the priests of this African religion and the prophets of Yahweh. Spiritual battles that decided the fate of entire nations. You probably never heard of this in school, never saw it in mainstream documentaries, because this story challenges the dominant narrative that African spirituality was primitive or inferior. The truth is exactly the opposite. These Black Kings commanded sophisticated religious systems, with complex cosmologies, elaborate ritualistic practices, and a deep understanding of the spiritual forces that govern the universe. They were not ignorant pagans as they were portrayed during centuries of cultural colonization. They were spiritual masters, divine strategists, intermediaries between the physical world and the celestial dimensions. And most fascinatingly, this religion still exists today, hidden in traditions that survived slavery, colonization, and the forced Christianization of Africa. It is alive in Afro-Brazilian cults, in the spiritual practices of the Caribbean, in the secret ceremonies that still take place in various parts of Africa. What you're about to discover in this video will completely change your perspective on history, religion, and spiritual power. Get ready, because the journey that begins now will take you to the secret temples of the Black Kings, reveal the names of the gods who defied Yahweh, and show you why this information has been systematically erased from humanity's collective consciousness. Now tell me something. Do you really know the complete story of African spirituality? Because what you were taught in school was an extremely summarized and distorted version of reality. This video is not just another superficial documentary about African culture. Here you will discover secrets that have been kept for generations, knowledge that colonizers tried to destroy, truths that challenge everything you've learned about religion and history. Why is this important to you? Because understanding this hidden religion of the Black Kings is understanding how spiritual power really works in the world. It's discovering that the history of humanity is much more complex and fascinating than textbooks reveal. It's opening your eyes to a universe of ancestral knowledge that can completely transform your perspective on faith, culture, and identity. Imagine discovering that there is a millennial spiritual tradition, as powerful as Judaism or Christianity, but which was deliberately silenced because it represented a threat to Western religious hegemony. This religion had its own sacred texts, its own prophets, its own documented miracles, and most incredibly, she taught that human beings could connect directly with the divine without intermediaries, that each person carried within themselves a spark of the God's power. This was too revolutionary for a time when religious institutions controlled access to the sacred. The kings who practiced this faith were considered demigods, direct descendants of the deities, living channels of celestial power on earth. They ruled not only with military force, but with unquestionable spiritual authority. Their priests performed rituals that, according to historical accounts, produced phenomena that defied natural laws. We are talking about miraculous healings, accurate prophecies, invocations of the forces of nature, communication with ancestors and spirits. All of this is documented not only in African oral traditions, but also in texts by Arab travelers, European merchants, and even in some biblical accounts that were carefully interpreted to minimize the power of these practices. You are about to delve into a deep investigation that will connect dots that have never been connected before. You'll understand why the Black Pharaohs of the Kingdom of Kush were feared not only as warriors, but as powerful sorcerers. You'll discover how the kings of Axum in Ethiopia maintained spiritual traditions that blended Jewish elements with ancestral African practices. You'll learn the secrets of the Vodun kings of Dahomey, who commanded armies of Amazons and priests capable of invoking the Orishas in decisive battles. And here comes the most important request. If you truly want to understand this profound knowledge, you need to commit to watching until the end. Every minute of this video reveals a deeper layer of this hidden history. And while you watch, leave a comment saying what you think of this revelation. Write in the comments which part surprised you the most, because your engagement helps this knowledge reach more people who need to know this truth. And of course, if you want to support this type of content that reveals hidden truths, leave a like now, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell because there are many more revelations coming soon. This is a journey of discovery and awakening, and you are among the few who will have access to this knowledge compiled in such a complete way. Let's embark together on this historical and spiritual investigation that will change your perception forever. When discussing the hidden religion of African kings, we must first understand that Africa was not a spiritually homogeneous continent. Hundreds of different religious systems existed, each with its own particularities, but all sharing fundamental principles that radically differentiated them from the Abrahamic religions. These African spiritual systems were based on a cosmology that viewed the universe as an interconnected web of living forces, where everything possessed a spiritual essence, from stones and rivers to animals and human beings. African gods were not distant and inaccessible entities like Yahweh was portrayed in Jewish tradition. They were active, present forces that constantly manifested in people's daily lives. The Orishas in Yoruba territory, the Voduns among the Fan of Dahomey, the Nkesis in Congo, the Abazim among the Ashanti, all these were gods who walked among humans, who communicated through spiritual possessions, who intervened directly in human affairs. And here's the crucial point. These gods didn't demand blind submission like Yahweh demanded of the Hebrews. They established exchange relationships, mutual agreements, partnerships between the divine and the human. An African king wasn't a servant of his gods. He was a partner, a collaborator in the project of maintaining cosmic order. This created a completely different power dynamic. When the first contacts between Hebrews and Africans occurred, especially during the period of the Kingdom of Cush that dominated Egypt in the 25th dynasty, there was an unprecedented cultural and spiritual clash. The Cushite kings, whom the Hebrews called Ethiopians, not only militarily conquered Egypt, but brought with them their spiritual practices that had existed long before Moses ascended Mount Sinai. These black kings worshipped Amun, but not the domesticated Egyptian Amun of the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. They worshipped an older, more powerful, more primordial version of Amun that had deep roots in Nubian spirituality. And this version of Amun was intrinsically connected to a pantheon of African deities who did not recognize the supremacy of Yahweh. This caused an immense theological problem for the Hebrew prophets who preached absolute monotheism. How to explain that other peoples existed with their own gods, performing their own miracles, building their own prosperous empires without ever having heard of Yahweh? The solution found was to demonize these practices, labeling them as paganism, witchcraft, abominations. But historical texts tell a different story. They reveal that African priests were extremely respected even by neighboring peoples who recognized their spiritual power. When we read about the confrontations between Moses and Pharaoh's magicians in the book of Exodus, many contemporary scholars argue that these magicians were actually Nubian priests, trained in ancestral African spiritual arts. The fact that they were able to replicate Moses's early miracles, transforming staffs into snakes and water into blood, demonstrates that they possessed real and powerful spiritual knowledge. The biblical narrative obviously favors Moses and Yahweh, but the simple fact of acknowledging that African magicians were able to perform similar prodigies is an implicit admission that real spiritual power existed operating through non-Hebrew religious systems. This is fundamental to understanding why this African religion was seen as a threat. It wasn't just a matter of idolatry or polytheism. It was a matter of spiritual power competing directly with the power of Yahweh. And on several documented historical occasions, African kings and their priests emerged victorious from these confrontations. King Taharka of the 25th dynasty, for example, not only resisted Assyrian attempts at domination, but expanded his empire while keeping his African spiritual practices intact. He built more pyramids than any other pharaoh, but his pyramids were different, reflecting a distinctly Nubian aesthetic and cosmology. The temples he erected were dedicated not only to traditional Egyptian gods, but also to the Kushite deities his ancestors worshipped long before Egyptian civilization existed. And here comes a fascinating detail that few historians adequately explore. There is archaeological and textual evidence suggesting that some Hebrew spiritual practices were actually influenced by, or even borrowed from, African traditions. The concept of the portable tabernacle that the Hebrews used in the desert has remarkable parallels with portable sacred structures used by Nubian and Kushite peoples. The practice of circumcision, which became central to Jewish identity, was already practiced by African peoples thousands of years before Abraham. The use of incense, sacred oils, animal sacrifices, all these practices had well-established equivalents in ancestral African religions. This does not diminish the importance of Judaism, but it contextualizes that religious practices never occur in a cultural vacuum. There were exchanges, mutual influences, adaptations, and in many cases, African practices were older and more developed. The African kings who maintained these spiritual traditions were not primitive or superstitious. They were leaders of sophisticated civilizations that possessed writing systems, advanced astronomy, complex metallurgy, and monumental architecture. Their religion was not an obstacle to progress. It was an integral part of a cosmological system that viewed science and spirituality as complementary, not opposed. They studied the stars not only to create agricultural calendars, but because they believed that celestial movements reflected the will of the gods. They developed advanced medical knowledge because their healing priests believed that illness was a spiritual imbalance that needed to be treated in both body and soul. This holistic approach produced impressive results. There are accounts from medieval Arab travelers describing cures performed by African priests that defied any medical explanation of the time. Injuries that should have been fatal were healed with combinations of herbs, rituals, and invocations. Diseases were diagnosed through divinatory processes that demonstrated surprising accuracy. All of this was part of a coherent spiritual system that viewed the world as permeated by forces that could be understood, negotiated, and directed through specialized knowledge and correct ritual practices. Now let's delve into the most surprising revelation about this religion of the African Black Kings. It had a conception of the divine that was simultaneously more democratic and more complex than Hebrew monotheism. While Yahweh demanded absolute exclusivity and presented himself as the only true God, African spiritual systems recognized a supreme creative force above all other gods. But this force did not directly involve itself in everyday human affairs. Among the Yoruba, this supreme force was called Olodumare, or Olorun, the owner of the sky, the source of all existence. But Olodumare was so transcendent, so beyond human comprehension, that it made no sense to try to communicate directly with this entity. Instead, Olodumare created the Orishas, which were emanations, aspects, manifestations of his own essence, each responsible for different domains of existence. Shango ruled over thunder and justice. Oshun controlled fresh water and love. Ogun was the lord of iron and war. Yemanja commanded the oceans and motherhood, and so on. This theological structure was incredibly sophisticated because it recognized that reality is too multifaceted to be governed by a single divine personality. It was a theology that reflected the complexity of the observable universe. And here's the shock. When Christian missionaries arrived in Africa centuries later, many African priests had no difficulty incorporating the idea of Jesus Christ into their pantheons. They simply saw him as just another Orisha, another manifestation of the divine. This infuriated the missionaries who insisted on the exclusivity of Christ, but for the Africans, excluding all other gods in favor of just one seemed a diminution of divine greatness, not an elevation. The kings who ruled under this spiritual cosmology possessed a type of authority that was simultaneously political and sacred in an inseparable way. The African concept of divine kingship was different from the European concept of the divine right of kings. In Europe, kings ruled by God's permission, but were fundamentally human. In Africa, especially in societies like the Yoruba, the Fon, the Ashanti, and many others, the king was literally considered an earthly manifestation of the divine. He did not rule for the gods. He was the incarnate God ruling his people. The Oba of Benin, the Oba of Ife, the Alafin of Oyo, all these royal titles carried a spiritual dimension, where the king was seen as the living link between the world of the ancestors, the world of the gods, and the world of the living. This conferred upon him an absolute authority that could not be questioned, because to question him was to question the cosmic order itself. And this authority was maintained through elaborate ritual systems where the king participated in ceremonies that constantly reaffirmed his connection with the divine. There were annual renewal rituals where the king symbolically died and was reborn, fertility rituals where his sexual potency was seen as a guarantee of the land's prosperity, and justice rituals where his decisions were considered direct pronouncements from the gods. All of this created an extremely stable and centralized power structure. But at the same time, there were checks and balances. The priests of the Orishas, although serving the king, also had independent authority derived from their connection with specific deities. In some societies, there were councils of elders, or secret societies, that could even depose a king if he seriously deviated from his sacred role. This demonstrates that despite the theocratic nature of these systems, there was an understanding that power needed to be exercised responsibly. Now, when these African religious systems encountered the monotheism of Yahweh, conflict was inevitable. The Hebrew prophets could not accept the legitimate existence of other gods. For them, the Orishas, Vodans, and other African deities were demons, evil spirits that deceived people. But the Africans had a radically different perspective. They did not see Yahweh as the only God, but as the tribal God of the Hebrews, powerful certainly, but not necessarily superior to their own gods. This relativistic perspective regarding the divine was unacceptable to the followers of Yahweh, who based their entire identity on the idea of being the chosen people of the one true God. And here enter the direct confrontations documented in historical and biblical texts. When the Bible speaks of the Hebrews being forbidden from mixing with the Ethiopians and Cushites, it wasn't just racial xenophobia, it was fear of spiritual contamination. The prophets knew that African religion was attractive, powerful, and had its own miracles and wonders. There were periods in the history of Israel where the worship of African gods became common even in Jerusalem. Solomon, the wisest king of Israel, had Ethiopian wives who brought with them the worship of their gods. This was seen as a terrible apostasy by the prophets, but it also reveals that these African religious systems had a real appeal. They were not easily dismissed as primitive superstition. The biblical texts attempt to present Yahweh's victory over these other gods as inevitable and absolute, but the real story is much more complex. African kingdoms that maintained their ancestral spiritual practices thrived for centuries. The kingdom of Axum in Ethiopia eventually adopted Christianity, but it was a Christianity so blended with ancestral African practices that it remains unique to this day. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains rituals, symbols, and practices that have clear roots in pre-Christian spiritual traditions. They keep the Ark of the Covenant in Axum, claim to be direct descendants of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and maintain a Judeo-Christian African tradition that defies simple categorization. And this leads us to a fundamental insight. The religion of the Black African kings was not simply defeated or replaced. It adapted, transformed, and survived through syncretism, fusion, and resistance. When enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas, they could not openly practice their religions, so they created secret codes, associating their Orishas with Catholic saints. Shango became Saint Jerome, Yemanja became Our Lady. But behind this Christian facade, ancestral African practices remained alive. Candomblé in Brazil, Santeria in Cuba, Vodou in Haiti, all these religions are direct descendants of the spiritual practices of African kings who defied Yahweh. And they still exist, they are still practiced, they are still powerful. Let's now explore the concrete historical evidence that proves not only the existence, but also the political and spiritual power of this religion of the Black Kings, starting with the Kingdom of Cush, which dominated Egypt during the 25th dynasty from approximately 774 to 656 BC. The Kushite kings were not foreign conquerors trying to adapt to Egyptian culture. They saw themselves as restorers of the true Egyptian tradition that had been corrupted by the Libyan pharaohs of previous dynasties. But at the same time, they maintained distinctly Nubian and Kushite spiritual practices. The pyramids they built in Meroe and Napata were different from the classic Egyptian pyramids, steeper, smaller, but more numerous. They built more than 200 pyramids, more than all of Egypt. And these pyramids contained inscriptions and art that reveal a hybrid cosmology, mixing Egyptian elements with clearly African symbolism. King Taharka, the most famous Kushite pharaoh, is directly mentioned in the Bible, in the book of Isaiah and the second book of Kings. He is presented as a potential ally of Judah against the Assyrian threat. But what the Bible doesn't mention in detail is that Taharka was considered a demigod by his people. He performed elaborate rituals where he communicated directly with Amun and other deities. Inscriptions found in his temples describe prophetic visions he received, divine guidance for military campaigns, and miracles performed in his name. This was not empty propaganda. It was part of a religious system where the pharaoh truly saw himself and was seen as a direct channel of divine power. And this spiritual power translated into real political power. Under Taharka's rule, Kush resisted Assyrian invasions for decades, something few kingdoms managed to do at that time. When the Assyrians finally conquered Egypt, the Kushites retreated to Nubia and continued their independent kingdom for another 1,000 years, keeping their religious practices intact. This demonstrates extraordinary spiritual and cultural resilience. Moving forward in time, we find the kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia, which was contemporary with the Roman Empire and rivaled it in power and sophistication. Aksum controlled crucial trade routes between Africa, Asia, and Europe. Its kings minted their own gold, silver, and bronze coins, something only the most powerful empires could do. And these coins bore religious symbols that blended elements of Judaism, early Christianity, and ancestral African spiritual practices. King Ezana of Aksum, who reigned in the 4th century AD, is credited with the official conversion of Ethiopia to Christianity. But this conversion was not a complete break with ancestral practices. Ezana continued to use titles that identified him as the son of invincible gods. His inscriptions speak of Mahrem, the Aksumite warrior god, alongside references to the Christian god. This suggests that the conversion was more of an addition to the pantheon than a complete replacement. And this syncretic characteristic remains in Ethiopian tradition to this day. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is technically Christian, but maintains practices such as circumcision, observance of Old Testament dietary laws, and a reverence for the Ark of the Covenant that goes far beyond normative Christianity. They claim to possess the true Ark of the Covenant in the Church of St. Mary of Zion in Aksum, guarded by a virgin monk who dedicates his entire life to protecting it. No one but him can see it. This creates a spiritual mystery that connects Ethiopia directly to the Hebrew tradition, but in a way that Ethiopians control, not Hebrews or their modern descendants. This inversion of spiritual power is significant. Ethiopians do not see themselves as converts or spiritually subjugated. They see themselves as legitimate heirs to traditions that precede and transcend both Judaism and Christianity as we know them. Moving down to West Africa, we find the great empires that flourished between the 10th and 19th centuries: Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Kanem-Bornu, the Yoruba kingdoms, the Kingdom of Benin, the Kingdom of Congo, Dahomey, among many others. Each of these empires had elaborate religious systems that underpinned complex political structures. The Mali Empire, for example, is often presented as an Islamic empire because its most famous king, Mansa Musa, made a spectacular pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century. But before Islam became dominant among the elites, Mali was ruled by kings who practiced the traditional Mandinka religion, based on the worship of ancestors and nature spirits. And even after official Islamization, ancestral practices continued among the common people, and even among some members of royalty. This created constant tension between Muslim clerics who wanted Islamic purity and the populations who saw Islam as an additional layer on top of their ancestral beliefs, not a replacement. In the Kingdom of Benin, the situation was even more interesting. The Oba of Benin was considered a living deity, a direct descendant of Oduduwa, the creator of the earth according to Yoruba mythology. The royal palace in Benin City was as much a spiritual as political complex. There were altars dedicated to royal ancestors, where regular sacrifices were performed to maintain the connection with the spiritual world. The famous Benin bronzes, now scattered in European museums, after being looted by the British in 1897, were in fact ritual objects. They were not merely decorative art, they were representations of ancestors, gods, and significant spiritual events. Each bronze plaque told a story that reinforced the divine legitimacy of the monarchy. And the Oba did not rule alone in spiritual terms. There was an elaborate hierarchy of priests, each specializing in different aspects of the spiritual world. There were priests of Olokun, the god of the sea and wealth. There were priests of Ogun, the god of iron and war. There were diviners specializing in Ifa, the oracular system that allowed direct communication with the Orishas. This Ifa divination system deserves special attention because it demonstrates the intellectual sophistication of the Yoruba religion. Ifa is not random superstition. It is a complex mathematical system based on binary combinations that generate 256 main configurations called Otis, each associated with specific stories, proverbs, and guidance. A Babalawo, a priest of Ifa, spends decades memorizing these combinations and their interpretations. The consultation process involves casting cowrie shells or opale necklaces in a specific way, interpreting the resulting pattern, and reciting the associated stories that contain guidance for the situation of the person consulting. This system is so complex and internally consistent that it has been recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity, not as folklore or a curiosity, but as a legitimate system of knowledge that deserves preservation. This is significant because it validates what African kings have always known. Their religion was not primitive, it was sophisticated, it was powerful, it was capable of guiding personal and political decisions with genuine wisdom. But here's where the story gets even more fascinating and controversial. There is growing, though disputed, evidence that some of the biblical confrontations between Yahweh's prophets and magicians or sorcerers may have been encounters with highly trained African priests. We've already mentioned Pharaoh's magicians who confronted Moses. But there's another, even more intriguing biblical episode: the confrontation between the prophet Elijah and the 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, described in the first book of Kings, chapter 18. Baal was a Canaanite deity, but many scholars point out that the cult of Baal had connections to African religious practices through trade and cultural routes linking the Levant to East Africa and Egypt. The challenge was simple. Each side would prepare a sacrifice, but would not light the fire. The true God would manifest himself by sending fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice. Baal's prophets prayed, danced, and cut themselves in ritualistic frenzy for hours, but nothing happened. Then Elijah invoked Yahweh, and fire came down from heaven, consuming not only the sacrifice but also the altar stone and the surrounding water. A complete victory for Yahweh, right? But here's the interesting detail. The biblical text records that the prophets of Baal used practices that are extremely similar to those used in traditional African religions to this day. The ecstatic dance, the ritual cuts on the body, the prolonged frenzy, all of this is found in ceremonies of spiritual possession in Afro-Brazilian religions, in Haitian Vodou, in traditional African practices. This suggests that perhaps there was more connection between these practices than is generally recognized. And here comes the part that many academics avoid openly discussing. What if the prophets of Baal that day simply couldn't complete the ritual correctly, not because their gods were false, but because the conditions weren't right according to their own theology? In traditional African religions, the gods are not servants who appear on command. They are forces with their own wills and agendas. They may choose not to manifest themselves if they are not approached correctly, if the sacrifices are not adequate, if the astrological timing is not favorable. This does not invalidate the existence of these gods within the logic of these religions. It only recognizes that the relationship with the divine is more complex than pressing a button and receiving a miracle. But obviously, the biblical narrative cannot present this nuance because its objective is to establish the absolute supremacy of Yahweh. Moving forward in history, we find another fascinating episode: the visit of the Queen of Sheba to King Solomon, recorded both in the first book of Kings and in the Ethiopian chronicles known as Kebra Nagast. The biblical version presents this visit as a queen impressed by Solomon's wisdom and the glory of Yahweh. But Ethiopian tradition tells a different and much more interesting story. According to the Kebra Nagast, the Queen of Sheba, called Makeda in Ethiopian tradition, was a powerful monarch in her own right, ruling a rich and sophisticated kingdom. She visited Solomon not as a supplicant, but as an equal. interested in cultural and spiritual exchanges. During this visit, according to tradition, she and Solomon had a son named Menelik. When Menelik grew up and visited his father in Jerusalem, he is said to have brought with him to Ethiopia the true Ark of the Covenant, which remains there to this day, according to Ethiopian belief. This narrative is revolutionary because it completely reverses the dynamics of spiritual power. It is not the Hebrews protecting the most sacred object of Judaism in Jerusalem. It is the Ethiopian Africans who possess the Ark, making them the true guardians of the covenant between God and humanity. This spiritually elevates Ethiopia above Israel, and the Ethiopians take this extremely seriously. For them, it is not myth or legend, it is factual history that establishes their special position in the divine plan. This represents the kind of spiritual authority that African kings claimed, not derivative of Judaism or Christianity, but parallel or even superior. Another powerful example comes from the Kingdom of Congo in the 15th and 16th centuries. When the Portuguese arrived in the Congo in 1482, they found a highly organized kingdom with a complex religion centered on the worship of Nzambi Mapungu, the supreme creator god, and various Nkisis, spirits, or lesser gods. The Mana-Congo, the title of the king of the Congo, was seen as an intermediary between the spiritual and physical worlds. King Nzinga Nkuvu initially converted to Christianity in 1491, taking the name John I. But this conversion was strategic and superficial. He continued practicing ancestral traditions, keeping multiple wives, and performing traditional rituals. His son, Afonso I, adopted Christianity more sincerely, but even so he faced massive resistance from traditional priests and nobles who saw the new religion as a threat to the cosmological order that sustained the kingdom. This resistance reveals something important. African religion was not merely a set of private beliefs. It was the foundation of the entire social, political, and economic structure. Abandoning it meant risking the collapse of the entire system. And in many cases, such as in the Kingdom of Congo, this prediction proved correct. Progressive Christianization weakened traditional structures of authority, facilitated Portuguese penetration, and eventually contributed to the kingdom's collapse and the intensification of the slave trade. Traditional priests had warned that abandoning the ancestors and the Nkisis would bring disaster, and from their perspective, that is exactly what happened. Now we need to talk about the most censored and misunderstood aspect of the religion of the African Black Kings: the ritual use of altered states of consciousness, spiritual possession, and practices that European colonizers and Christian missionaries labeled as witchcraft or diabolical sorcery. But what really happened in these rituals? Why were they so powerful that they needed to be suppressed with such violence? Spiritual possession is central to virtually all traditional African religions. In Brazilian candomblé, an initiated person can embody an orixá during a ritual, at which point their individual consciousness gives way, and the god literally takes control of the body, speaking, dancing, and acting through that human body. This is not theater or pretense for the practitioners. It is a real and profoundly transformative experience for both the embodied and the witness. And here is what the colonizers and missionaries never wanted to admit. These states of possession produce measurable and extraordinary effects. People in a trance-like possession demonstrate increased physical strength, perform movements that would normally be impossible for their bodies, speak in languages or dialects they don't know in a normal state, and demonstrate knowledge of past or future events they couldn't normally know. All of this is documented not only in internal religious accounts but also in observations by anthropologists, researchers, and even skeptics who have witnessed these phenomena. The standard materialistic explanation is that all of this can be explained by psychology, mass hysteria, conscious or unconscious trickery. But this explanation fails to capture the consistency, depth, and coherence of these experiences across centuries and continents. When a person embodies Zango in Brazil, they behave in a manner consistent with how Zango manifested in possessions in West Africa centuries earlier, despite no conscious connection between these contexts. This suggests that something deeper is happening than simple self-suggestion. The African kings who ruled within these spiritual systems were not passive observers of possession. They were often high-level initiates who could enter altered states of consciousness to receive direct divine guidance. There are historical accounts of African kings entering prophetic trances before decisive battles, emerging with military strategies that led to victory against numerically superior enemies. This was seen as concrete proof that the gods were actively supporting their chosen kings. And here comes the most disturbing element for proponents of Abrahamic monotheism. These rituals worked, not just subjectively, but they produced tangible results in the physical world. When an African priest performed a ritual to bring rain, it often rained. When he performed a healing ritual, people often healed. When he divined the outcome of future events, his predictions often proved accurate. This created an immense theological and philosophical problem. If only Yahweh or the Christian God is real and powerful, how can we explain that rituals dedicated to other gods also produce results? The Christian theological solution was to claim that these rituals did indeed work, but were fueled by deceptive demons, not legitimate gods. But this explanation is problematic because it admits that real spiritual power exists operating outside of God's control, which calls into question divine omnipotence. The alternative is to completely deny that African rituals produced any real results, labeling everything as coincidence, fraud, or illusion. But this complete denial ignored abundant evidence to the contrary and required dismissing thousands of testimonies from people who experienced or witnessed these powers directly. Let's talk specifically about some practices that were particularly feared and demonized. The use of spiritually charged objects called fetishes by Europeans, but known as nkisis in the Congo, botsio in Dahomey, and various other names in different African cultures. These objects were not idols in the sense of statues that people mistakenly worshipped thinking that stone or wood were gods. They were carefully prepared receptacles where spiritual forces were invited to reside temporarily. A nkisi was created through an elaborate ritual process where a specialized priest called an nganga combined specific material elements, earth from sacred places, herbs with spiritual properties, remains of sacrificed animals, sometimes elements of human ancestors, all while performing invocations and offerings to attract a specific spiritual entity to inhabit the object. Once activated, the nkisi was treated as a living entity with its own will, not as an inanimate object. It needed to be fed with regular offerings, consulted before important decisions, and appeased if neglected. And practitioners consistently reported that these objects demonstrated real power. Protective nkisis supposedly warned their owners of impending dangers. Hunting nkisis ensured success on expeditions. War nkisis protected warriors in battle. Europeans who witnessed this were simultaneously fascinated and terrified. Missionaries burned nkisis by the thousands, but disturbing accounts of supernatural consequences for those who destroyed them continued to circulate. Unexplained illnesses, strange accidents, sudden madness. These accounts were simply dismissed as superstition by rationalist Europeans, but they accumulated in sufficient volume to create an aura of genuine fear around these African practices. Another aspect that caused particular terror was the power of African priests over life and death through curses or spells. In virtually all traditional African societies, there were spiritual experts who knew how to manipulate invisible forces to cause harm from a distance. This was not witchcraft in the European sense of pacts with the devil. It was a form of spiritual technology based on the understanding that thoughts, intentions, and rituals could affect physical reality, especially when channeled through esoteric knowledge and objects of power. And here is the most disturbing aspect. There are numerous documented accounts, including from skeptical Europeans, of people dying or becoming seriously ill soon after being publicly cursed by a powerful African priest. The psychosomatic explanation only goes so far. Yes, a person who believes they are cursed can become ill from psychological stress. But there are cases where the victim didn't even know they had been cursed, or cases where the effects were too specific to be merely psychological. This suggests that perhaps, just perhaps, these African priests truly possessed knowledge about forces that modern science still doesn't fully understand. And if that's the case, then the effort to suppress this religion wasn't just cultural imperialism. It was also an effort to control or eliminate sources of power that escaped the monopoly of European religious and secular institutions. We now need to examine why this religion of the Black Kings was so systematically erased and demonized, and the devastating consequences of this cultural erasure. It was not a historical accident nor simply a side effect of colonization. It was a deliberate and conscious campaign to destroy the spiritual foundations of African identity and autonomy. European colonizers, from the first contacts in the 15th and 16th centuries, quickly realized that they could not completely subjugate Africans as long as their traditional spiritual structures remained intact. An African who believed that his ancestors protected him, that his gods guaranteed the fertility of his land, that his king was an incarnate deity, that African had a structure of meaning that made him psychologically resistant to domination. He could be physically enslaved, but his soul remained free. To break this spiritual resistance, it was necessary to destroy or subvert the traditional religion. The strategies used were multiple and devastatingly effective. First, direct demonization. Christian missionaries taught that all African gods were demons, that all ritual practices were sinful, and that salvation was only possible through complete conversion to Christianity and total rejection of ancestral heritage. Converted Africans were forced to burn their sacred objects, publicly renounce their ancestors, and adopt European Christian names. This was not merely religious conversion, it was deliberate cultural genocide. Second, intellectual delegitimization. European academics developed pseudoscientific racist theories claiming that Africans were mentally inferior, incapable of philosophical abstraction or theological sophistication. Therefore, their religions were automatically considered primitive, superstitious, and irrational. This justified ignoring them or treating them with paternalistic condescension instead of serious engagement. When anthropologists finally began studying African religions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they often did so through evolutionary lenses that viewed these religions as primitive stages of religious development that would eventually evolve into sophisticated monotheism. Third, the physical destruction of texts, temples, and religious experts. Libraries were burned, such as the famous destruction of the University of Timbuktu by Moroccan invaders in 1591. Temples were demolished or converted into churches. Priests and priestesses were killed, enslaved, or forced underground. Kings who resisted Christianization were deposed or assassinated. An entire universe of oral knowledge that was transmitted from generation to generation through secret initiations was disrupted or fragmented. Fourth, the strategic assimilation of African elements within Christianity in a way that emptied its original power. Catholic saints were mapped onto African orishas, but in a way that subordinated the orishas to the Christian framework instead of recognizing them as independent deities. This allowed for an appearance of continuity that facilitated conversion, but fundamentally transformed the nature of spiritual practice. And fifth, perhaps most insidious, the internalization of inferiority by Africans themselves. Generations of Africans were educated in colonial school systems where they learned that their own history and culture were inferior, that their ancestors were ignorant savages who were civilized by the arrival of Europeans, that any success or sophistication in pre-colonial African societies must have been external influence, from Arabs or even Atlanteans or aliens, any explanation less than admitting that Black Africans were capable of building sophisticated civilizations on their own. This cultural brainwashing was so successful that even today many Africans and descendants of Africans in the diaspora feel shame or discomfort regarding traditional African religions, seeing them as backward compared to Christianity or Islam. The consequences of this spiritual erasure were catastrophic and continue to reverberate to this day. When you destroy a people's religion, you destroy much more than their beliefs about gods. You destroy their ethical system, their social structure, their connection to the land and ancestors, their sense of identity and cosmic belonging. You create a spiritual void that leaves people vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation. An African disconnected from their ancestral spiritual roots is an African who is easier to colonize, to enslave, to convince that they are inferior and deserve their subordinate condition. And we can see the effects of this spiritual destruction in contemporary issues. The identity crisis that many young Black people face in the African diaspora, seeking to connect with their heritage but finding gaps and silences where there should be rich ancestral knowledge. The internalized racism that leads some Africans to reject anything associated with traditional Africa as primitive or embarrassing. The spiritual alienation that leads people to adopt Abrahamic religions that have historically been used to justify their oppression. because these are seen as more legitimate than ancestral traditions. But here's the extraordinary thing. Despite all this, the religion of the Black Kings did not die. It survived, it adapted, it endured. In the Torero communities in Brazil, in the Santeria temples in Cuba, in the Vodou temples in Haiti, in the Obeah practices in Jamaica, in the Kumina ceremonies, in the Rastafari traditions that reaffirm African divinity, millions of people in the Americas and the Caribbean practice religions that are direct descendants of the spiritual traditions of the African Black Kings. And in Africa itself, despite centuries of Christianization and Islamization, traditional practices never completely disappeared. They remain alive, sometimes syncretized with Abrahamic religions, sometimes preserved in purer forms in rural communities or in urban secret societies. And in recent decades, there has been a growing movement of spiritual re-Africanization, where Africans and descendants of Africans consciously reject imported religions and return to ancestral traditions. This movement sees the recovery of traditional African spirituality not as a regression to primitivism, but as spiritual decolonization, as the recovery of valid and powerful ancestral knowledge that was unjustly suppressed. And here's something that should make you think. If this religion was really as primitive and powerless as the colonizers claimed, why was so much effort required to destroy it? Why not simply let it wither and die naturally in the face of the obvious superiority of Christianity? The fact that it took massive violence, systematic cultural destruction, and centuries of propaganda to suppress traditional African religion suggests that it was actually far more powerful and resilient than its detractors wanted to admit. Let's now explore the deeper spiritual and philosophical dimension of this religion of the Black Kings, because it offers perspectives on the nature of reality that are radically different from those offered by Abrahamic religions. And these perspectives may have genuine relevance to contemporary questions about spirituality, consciousness, and our relationship with the cosmos. A fundamental difference is the conception of time and ancestry. In Abrahamic religions, time is linear. There is creation, there is history progressing towards some eschatological end, final judgment, resurrection, eternity. There is a clear separation between past, present, and future. The dead are dead until they are resurrected. In traditional African religions, time is much more cyclical and porous. The past is not dead. It is alive in the present through the ancestors. Ancestors are not distant souls awaiting judgment in some beyond. They are active presences that continue to influence and participate in the lives of their descendants. A properly honored and invoked ancestor may appear in dreams, offer guidance, intervene in difficult situations, even take temporary control of a living body during possession rituals. This creates a continuity between generations that is much more immediate and concrete than in Christian theology. You are not alone facing life. You have an entire lineage of ancestors who sustain you, protect you, and guide you. But this protection comes with responsibilities. You must honor your ancestors through offerings, rituals, and by living according to values they approve of. If you neglect your ancestors, they may distance themselves or even cause problems to get your attention. This creates an ethic of reciprocity that permeates all relationships, not only human to human, but human to ancestors, human to gods, human to nature. Nothing is free. Everything is an exchange. You give to receive. This is a much more ecological and relational worldview than biblical dominionism, which says that humans should subdue the earth. Another crucial difference is the understanding of the nature of the self or the soul. Christianity generally works with a simple duality, body and soul. You have a temporary physical body and an immortal soul that is your true self. Many African religions have much more complex conceptions. Among the Yoruba, for example, each person has multiple spiritual components. Era is the physical body. Imai is the life force that animates the body. Ori is individual consciousness and personal destiny. And there are other components depending on which specific tradition you are consulting. Your Ori, your spiritual head, is partially determined before you are born when you choose your destiny before Olodumare. But this destiny is not absolutely fixed. You can improve it or worsen it depending on your choices and how well you nourish and honor your Ori through specific rituals. This creates a sophisticated understanding of free will versus predestination that avoids the theological paradoxes that plague Christianity. You have a destiny, but you also have agency. Your life is a constant negotiation between these forces. And here's something fascinating. These African conceptions of multiple aspects of the self correspond remarkably to modern findings in neuroscience and psychology about the fragmented nature of consciousness. The Western idea of a unified, singular, and consistent self is increasingly being questioned by research, showing that we have multiple cognitive and motivational processes operating simultaneously, often in conflict with one another. Africans have known this for thousands of years and have built spiritual systems that take this multiplicity into account. Let's also talk about the relationship with nature. For Abrahamic religions, especially in their more fundamentalist forms, nature exists to be used by humans. God gave humans dominion over all creation. Animals, plants, minerals, all exist to serve human needs. There is a clear hierarchy with God at the top, humans below God, and all the rest of creation below humans. In traditional African religions, the hierarchy is much less rigid and the relationship is much more horizontal. Yes, humans have certain capabilities that other beings do not have, such as the ability to make offerings and perform rituals, but rivers have powerful spirits. Ancient trees are inhabited by entities. Mountains are sacred not because God appeared there once, but because they themselves are manifestations of the divine. Animals are not just resources, they are spiritual relatives. Many African clans have totemic animals that are considered ancestors or protectors of the clan. Killing or eating your clan's totemic animal would be a terrible taboo, essentially spiritual cannibalism. This animistic view, where everything is alive and laden with spiritual meaning, creates a far more sustainable environmental ethic than the unlimited exploitation justified by biblical dominionism. You can't simply cut down any tree. You need to ask permission from the tree's spirit, make appropriate offerings, perhaps plant another tree in compensation. You can't simply divert a river. You need to consult the river's spirit, understand if this will cause imbalance, perform appeasement rituals. All of this may seem like superstition to a modern rationalist mind, but it is becoming clear that these traditional practices, even if their supernatural justifications are questionable, produced far better ecological results than the modern rationalist approach of maximum resource exploitation. Sacred forests preserved by religious taboos are often the only remnants of native ecosystems in regions that have been completely deforested around them. Rivers protected by beliefs in aquatic spirits remain clean, while desecrated rivers become open sewers. Perhaps the African kings who protected these environmental spiritual practices were doing something far wiser than the rampant exploitation that modernization has brought. Now tell me something. What does all this mean to you today, here, now, in the 21st century? Why should it matter if African kings centuries ago worshipped Orishas or Anchises instead of Yahweh? Why should this story be more than an academic curiosity or a piece of cultural trivia? Because this story challenges fundamental narratives that still structure our contemporary world. The narrative that there is one universal religious truth and all others are false or demonic. The narrative that civilization and progress came from Europe to illuminate the rest of the dark and primitive world. The narrative that African spirituality was and is inferior to Abrahamic religions. These narratives are not harmless philosophical abstractions. They have real and terrible consequences. They justified slavery, saying it was Christianizing savages. They justified colonialism, saying it was civilizing primitives. They continue to justify contemporary racism, cultural stereotypes, and the marginalization of African and Afro-diasporic spiritual practices. When you discover that these narratives were built on lies, suppression of evidence, and deliberate distortion of history, it frees you to question other narratives as well. It frees you to explore spirituality in ways that aren't limited by Abrahamic orthodoxies. It frees you to recognize wisdom in traditions that have been delegitimized. For people of African descent specifically, reconnecting with ancestral spiritual traditions can be profoundly healing and empowering. Not because these traditions are perfect or without flaws, no religious tradition is, but because they offer an alternative to religions that have historically been tools of oppression. When you discover that your ancestors weren't ignorant savages waiting for European salvation, but were practitioners of sophisticated spiritual systems, powerful kings, wise priests, It transforms your self-image. It gives you ancestral pride, historical connection, a rich spiritual heritage to draw upon. And for people of any background, exploring these African traditions can expand your understanding of what is spiritually possible. If you were raised believing that Christianity, Islam, or scientific atheism are the only viable options, discovering African traditions reveals that there are other paths, other ways of relating to the divine, to ancestors, to nature. This doesn't mean you need to convert to Candomblé or Santeria, but it does mean you can begin to question assumptions you didn't even know you had about how spirituality works. Perhaps gods don't need to be jealous and demand exclusivity. Perhaps ancestors can be accessed directly without institutional intermediaries. Perhaps nature is sacred in itself, not just as the creation of a separate god. Perhaps your destiny is not entirely predetermined nor entirely random, but something you co-create in partnership with spiritual forces. These possibilities may seem strange or uncomfortable if you are accustomed to Abrahamic frameworks, but they have sustained entire civilizations for millennia. They deserve at least to be seriously considered instead of automatically dismissed as primitive superstition. And here's the final irony. Many of the most progressive contemporary spiritual movements in the West, from neo-paganism to New Age spirituality to ecofeminism, are rediscovering principles that have always been central to traditional African religions. The idea that everything is interconnected, that spirit permeates matter, that multiple forms of divinity can coexist, that humans should live in harmony with nature, that ancestors remain present and influential. All these ideas that seem radical and new in Western contexts are ancient and established in African contexts. So perhaps what we are witnessing is not linear progress from African primitivism to Western sophistication, but a cyclical movement where the West is finally catching up with wisdoms that Africa has always possessed. And if that is the case, perhaps we should stop looking at the religion of African Black kings as a dead historical curiosity and begin to see it as a living source of spiritual knowledge relevant to the challenges we face today. Challenges such as the ecological crisis, which could be addressed through a spirituality that sees nature as sacred. Challenges such as alienation and lack of meaning could be addressed through reconnection with ancestors and community. Challenges such as authoritarian power structures could be questioned through more horizontal and participatory spiritual models. This is not a naive romanticization of African traditions. They had and have problems, hierarchies, exclusions, and practices that can be questioned. But they also have profound wisdom that has been systematically ignored for too long. And recognizing this, honoring this, learning from this, does not diminish other spiritual traditions. It increases the spiritual richness available to all humanity. Comment below, what did you think of these revelations about the religion of African Black kings? Did this change your perspective on African history, spirituality, and culture? Share your reflections because this type of conversation is essential. We now need to talk about practical applications of this knowledge in your real life, because historical information only has value if it can inform how you live today. How can you integrate insights from the religion of African Black kings into your daily life, regardless of your own background or current religious beliefs? First, consider adopting a practice of honoring ancestors. This doesn't require you to literally believe that the spirits of your deceased ancestors are actively intervening in your life, but it can function as a powerful psychological practice of connecting with your lineage and history. Create a small altar or space in your home dedicated to ancestors. Place photos of grandparents, great-grandparents, other deceased relatives who were important. If you don't have photos or don't know your complete ancestral lineage, especially common for descendants of enslaved people, you can use symbols representing your ancestral origins or even a lit candle representing all known and unknown ancestors. Regularly, perhaps once a week, or on significant dates, spend time in this space. Talk to your ancestors. Tell them about your life, your challenges, your victories. Ask for guidance. Thank them for the struggles they faced that allowed your existence. Make symbolic offerings. Fresh water, coffee, foods you know they enjoyed. This may seem silly or strange at first, but many people who adopt practices of honoring ancestors report that it creates a deep sense of connection, belonging, and support. Even if you interpret this as purely psychological, as a way to access wisdom stored in your cultural or genetic memory, it can still be extremely valuable. Second, consider developing a more personal and spiritual relationship with the forces of nature. You don't need to literally believe in river or tree spirits, but you can begin to relate to natural elements in more reverent and conscious ways. If you regularly walk in a park or natural area, choose a specific tree to visit consistently. Touch it, sit leaning against it, observe it through the seasons. Begin to perceive it not as a background object, but as a living presence with its own history and intrinsic value. When you need to use natural resources, wood, water, plants, take a moment to acknowledge where they came from and give thanks. This may seem performative at first, but it gradually cultivates an ecological awareness that is increasingly necessary in our era of environmental crisis. Third, experiment with simple divination practices as a way to access intuition and subconscious wisdom. You don't need to become a trained Ifa Babalao, but you can use simple methods like flipping coins, drawing tarot cards, or even just asking a clear question before bed and paying attention to dreams. The effectiveness of these practices doesn't necessarily depend on actual supernatural forces. They work by creating a framework where your intuitive mind can communicate insights that your conscious, rational mind is blocking. When you cast tarot cards or cowrie shells and interpret the resulting symbols, you are essentially having a structured conversation with deeper parts of yourself. Fourth, explore movement and sound practices as ways to achieve altered states of consciousness. African religions traditionally use dance, singing, and percussion as technologies to enter trance and possession. You can adapt these ideas without a specific religious context. Dance freely to the sound of drums or rhythmic music, allowing your body to move intuitively without planned choreography. Chant or intone mantras, vocalize sounds, allowing the vibration to resonate through your body. These practices can induce altered states of consciousness that are therapeutic, insight-producing, and spiritually significant. Many cultures around the world have developed similar practices independently because they touch on something fundamental about how human consciousness works. Fifth, consider re-evaluating your relationship with community and individualism. The religion of African kings was fundamentally communal. You were not an isolated individual seeking personal salvation. You were a node in a network of relationships that included the living, the dead, gods, nature. Your identity was defined by these relationships, not in spite of them. This contrasts sharply with the hyper-individualism of modern Western societies, where you are encouraged to define yourself as autonomous, self-sufficient, independent. Try cultivating deeper, more interdependent relationships. Participate in communities, religious or secular, where mutual commitment is central. Practice asking for help when you need it and proactively offering help. Recognize that your life is intertwined with others in fundamental ways. This perspective can be liberating in a world that often makes you feel isolated and overwhelmed by the pressure to succeed entirely on your own merits. Sixth, if you have African or African diasporic heritage, consider exploring spiritual practices specific to your own cultural lineage. If your ancestors were Yoruba, explore Candomblé or Santeria. If they were from Congo, explore Palo Mayombe or Nkisi cults. If they were from other regions, research what spiritual traditions existed there. This can be complicated because centuries of slavery and colonization have created gaps and losses in transmitted knowledge. But there are growing communities and resources dedicated to recovering and preserving these traditions. Connecting with them can be a powerful part of ancestral healing and identity building. But even if you don't have African heritage, you can still learn from these traditions and apply respectfully adapted principles to your own life. The key is to avoid superficial cultural appropriation while still remaining open to intercultural wisdom. Problematic appropriation happens when you take symbols or practices out of context, ignore their origins and meanings, use them as fashion accessories or for commercial profit, without respecting or supporting the communities of origin. Respectful engagement happens when you seriously study, acknowledge origins, seek guidance from authentic practitioners, and adapt practices in ways that honor their original spirit, even if you cannot replicate exact forms. Seventh, use insights from this religion to question and dismantle internalized biases. If you grew up in cultures dominated by Christianity or Islam, you likely internalized, even unconsciously, ideas that African religions are primitive, demonic, or ridiculous. Recognizing the sophistication, power, and value of these traditions challenges these biases. And once you begin to question biases about African spirituality, you can begin to question other biases about African culture, African intelligence, and African contributions to global civilization. This is especially important for Black people who have been taught to internalize inferiority. Discovering the spiritual greatness of ancestral Black kings can be a powerful catalyst for healthy racial pride and self-esteem. Finally, consider how principles of this religion can inform activism and social justice. The emphasis on reciprocity, balance, and mutual responsibility can underpin an ethic of mutual care and the fair distribution of resources. The recognition of the sacredness of nature can motivate environmental activism. The valuing of ancestors can inspire commitment to intergenerational justice, ensuring that we leave a better world for descendants. The celebration of divine diversity can support pluralism and religious tolerance. All of this may seem distant from Orisha rituals and African temples, but it's all connected. Spiritual systems are never just about abstract beliefs. They shape how you see the world, how you relate to others, what values you prioritize, how you act. And the religion of the African Black kings shaped entire societies in ways that were often more just, sustainable, and humane than the systems that replaced them. Learning from this, honoring this, applying this, is not about going back to the past. It's about bringing ancestral wisdom to inform a better future. So, we've reached the end of this profound journey into the hidden religion of the Black kings who defied Yahweh. But this ending is actually a beginning, because now you have knowledge that most people will never access. You understand that the history of human spirituality is far richer, more diverse, and more complex than simplified narratives suggest. You know that African kings commanded sophisticated religious systems that rivaled or surpassed Abrahamic religions in theological complexity, spiritual power, and civilizational impact. You understand that the suppression of these traditions was not a historical accident, but deliberate cultural genocide motivated by fear of the power these practices represented. You recognize that these traditions did not die but survived, adapted, and continue to live on today in Afro-diasporic religions and African spiritual revitalization movements. And you now have the tools to begin applying insights from these traditions to your own life, whether through ancestral practices, connecting with nature, altered states of consciousness, or simply a more nuanced understanding of human spirituality. This changes everything if you allow it. It changes how you see history. It changes how you see Africa and Africans. It changes how you understand religion and spirituality. It changes how you position yourself in relation to dominant narratives. And for some of you, this can literally change your life, opening spiritual paths you didn't even know existed, reconnecting you with ancestors you had lost, giving you pride and heritage you were taught to despise. But this knowledge comes with responsibility. Responsibility to share these truths with others. Responsibility to challenge misinformation and prejudice when you encounter them. Responsibility to honor these traditions with respect and seriousness, not as exoticism or superficial appropriation. Responsibility to continue learning, because this video has only scratched the surface of a vast universe of African spiritual knowledge. So here's what I need you to do now. If you've watched this far, congratulations, you're part of a select group that truly commits to deep knowledge. Now show it by leaving your comment. Write exactly this: I discovered the truth about the Black Kings. This shows me that you truly reached the end and absorbed this entire journey. Leave a like because this type of content, which reveals hidden truths, needs your support to reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because there are many more historical and spiritual revelations coming. Turn on notifications because you don't want to miss the next videos. And most importantly, watch the next video that's appearing on your screen now, because this journey of discovery doesn't end here. There are deeper layers, more shocking revelations, more transformative knowledge waiting for you. Thank you for trusting me to guide you through this exploration of the hidden religion of the African Black Kings. May this knowledge illuminate your path and strengthen your connection to all the spiritual richness that humanity has created. Until the next video, stay with your ancestors, honor your heritage, and never stop questioning official narratives. The truth is out there, but you need to have the courage to seek it.